Hi, welcome back to U.S. History with Mr. Snyder, and today we're going to go a little bit deeper in the Vietnam War and discuss how it divided America into pro-war and anti-war factions, and specifically the Democratic Party into anti-war and pro-war factions. Learning targets today, we'll discuss the draft and how college students protested, specifically one society, the SDS. We'll discuss what the Tet Offensive was and the American reaction to it. And we'll summarize some factors that influence the 1968 presidential election, particularly the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. So let's discuss the draft. Critics argue that the original draft was not fair because it granted too many deferments, which means people don't have to sign up for the draft. College students, men who worked in predominantly white occupations were granted deferments for the draft. Protest against this led to the elimination of deferments for married men. If you were married before, you didn't have to sign up for the draft. Graduate students and then all students in college had to sign up for the draft, all men, that is. And the Selective Service, or the organization in charge of the draft, eventually installs a lottery system that made for less discrimination. And how it works is it goes by your birthday. So all the days of the year are put in a pool. They draw one out, and let's say, I believe the first one was September 14th. That one would be assigned number one. So all the people from 1946 through 51 or so, they were then required to report if they were born on September 14th in any of those years. The numbers with the random birthdays are then called in order, whatever was pulled second, whatever was pulled third, etc. The first 195 days selected were called forth to serve from that group, and from then on out, they held subsequent drafts for people who were born in 1951, 52, and 53. 125,000 men actually moved to Canada in order to avoid the draft. Others went to prison for not wanting to fight. These people were known as draft dodgers. Around half have since returned since that time, but most people stayed in Canada so that they didn't have to fight in the Vietnam War. 2.5 million men total served in Vietnam. Remember, we only had 500,000 there total at the most at a time. Most of these people are from poor working class backgrounds. Blacks comprise about 20% of the total deaths, even though they only comprised about 10% of the population. They were also less likely to be promoted to officer positions and more likely to serve in the combat positions. Activism begins to spread as people begin to oppose the war, and the SDS, or the Students for a Democratic Society, campaigns to end the war on college campuses through protests, demonstrations, and teach-ins, where they would use university facilities to hold lectures on what really was going on in Vietnam. And that is where we get to the credibility gap here in a second. Guerrilla tactics, the draft, and the failure to win a quick war lead to lost morale for both the troops and the people back home. Soldiers, in order to cope, turned to alcohol and drugs in Vietnam. Some people even fragged their superior officers, which was killing your superior officer. Back home, this becomes the first living room war because people are seeing it. Just as we watch it in class, people are seeing actual war footage every day on the news. And our leaders, like General Westmoreland and President Johnson, are confident that we're winning, but the images we see on television tell us otherwise. And so this credibility gap forms between what Johnson says and what the journalists report. And by 1967, Americans are split over whether we should be in the war. And that leads to some fireworks in 1968. 1968, the Tet Offensive is the turning point in the war. We were taking part in a week-long ceasefire for Tet, Tet is the Chinese New Year. And during this time, on January 31st, there are simultaneous attacks on South Vietnam cities by Viet Cong. So it still results, we're able to repel these attacks, and it still results in a communist defeat, but psychologically, it is a defeat for America because it shook our confidence. We have been giving these people all they can handle for the past 3 years or so, and they're still able to mount an attack of that size. So LBJ's popularity goes down after this. Later on that spring, Johnson does not seek he says, I'm not going to run for president again. I'm not going to seek, nor will I accept the Democratic nomination for president. He's too unpopular, and the presidential party is divided. Also, around that same time, Martin Luther King is assassinated. And so the nation is kind of in a state of chaos in 1968. So the Democrats now have to find a new presidential candidate. These two people were running even though the incumbent president is assumed to be the nominee. Eugene McCarthy was rallying a campaign against him. He's anti-war. Robert Kennedy is anti-war. Robert Kennedy, John's brother. So McCarthy and Kennedy feel that this war is draining away resources that could be used for fighting poverty and discrimination at home. So they're the two anti-war candidates going into the National Convention. But Robert Kennedy is murdered, and he is assassinated in California in June 1968 by Sirhan, and it was a shocker. I mean, that's another assassination that was key during this time. So that leads us into the National Party conventions. The Republicans are harassed, by a couple anti-war protesters, about 1,000 in Miami. They end up nominating former Vice President Richard Nixon, who is anti-war. And the Democrats, inside in the convention center in Chicago, hawks and doves clash with one another. And eventually, the Democrats choose Vice President Hubert Humphrey over the anti-war candidate McCarthy. So this is seen as a continuation of Johnson's war policies, and the anti-war protesters do not like this one bit. So outside, the Chicago police are rioting with protesters, beating them with mace and clubs, and some critics say they're using Gestapo tactics in order to protect the Democrats inside. The protesters respond by throwing rocks, glass bottles, and even bags of urine at the people with guns and clubs and mace. And so it's a fight outside, it's a fight inside, and the Democratic Party is in chaos in 1968. So the election of 1968 comes down to Nixon versus Humphrey. Nixon appeals to the silent majority, or those Americans, the majority of Americans who don't take part in these large demonstrations or protests. They're not hippies, and they go about their lives normally. He appeals to them. He wants to achieve what's called peace with honor, and he promises to begin withdrawing troops immediately. Humphreys, the former mayor of Minneapolis, the Metrodome there was the Hubert H. Humphrey Metrodome. He's the vice president under Johnson. He wins the Democratic nomination, but he's hurt by the third-party candidacy of George Wallace, who actually wins 5 southern states. It's not common for a third-party candidate to win any state, but George Wallace is the guy who wants segregation in the South again, so he wins 5 southern states. And Richard Nixon is eventually the winner of 1968, and he begins withdrawing troops immediately the next year. So that's all for your learning targets today. Make sure you took some good notes over this section, and I'll see you back in class. Goodbye.